Really achieving your childhood dreams. A slide from my talk. 4. The parent lottery. I won the parent lottery. I was born with the winning ticket, a major reason I was able to live out my childhood dreams. My mother was a tough, old-school English teacher with nerves of titanium. She worked her students hard, enduring those parents who complained that she expected too much from kids. As her son, I knew a thing or two about her high expectations, and that became my good fortune. My dad was a World War II medic who served in the Battle of the Bulge. He founded a nonprofit group to help immigrants' kids learn English. And for his livelihood, he ran a small business which sold auto insurance in inner-city Baltimore. His clients were mostly poor people with bad credit histories or few resources, and he'd find a way to get them insured and on the road. For a million reasons, my dad was my hero. I grew up comfortably middle class in Columbia, Maryland. Money was never an issue in our house, mostly because my parents never saw a need to spend much. They were frugal to a fault. We rarely went out to dinner. We'd see a movie maybe once or twice a year. Watch TV, my parents would say. It's free. Or better yet, go to the library. Get a book. When I was 2 years old and my sister was 4, my mom took us to the circus. I wanted to go again when I was 9. You don't need to go, my mom said. You've already been to the circus. It sounds oppressive by today's standards, but it was actually a magical childhood. I really do see myself as a guy who had this incredible leg up in life because I had a mother and a father who got so many things right. We didn't buy much, but we thought about everything. That's because my dad had this infectious inquisitiveness about current events, history, our lives. In fact, growing up, I thought there were 2 types of families. 1. Those who need a dictionary to get through dinner. 2. Those who don't. We were number 1. Most every night, we'd end up consulting the dictionary, which we kept on a shelf just 6 steps from the table. If you have a question, my folks would say, then find the answer. The instinct in our house was never to sit around like slobs and wonder. We knew a better way. Open the encyclopedia. Open the dictionary. Open your mind. My dad was also an incredible storyteller, and he always said that stories should be told for a reason. He liked humorous anecdotes that turned into morality tales. He was a master at that kind of story, and I soaked up his techniques. That's why, when my sister, Tammy, watched my last lecture online, she saw my mouth moving, she heard a voice, but it wasn't mine. It was Dad's. She knew I was recycling more than a few of his choicest bits of wisdom. I won't deny that for a second. In fact, at times I felt like I was channeling my dad on stage. I quote my father to people almost every day. Part of that is because if you dispense your own wisdom, others often dismiss it. If you offer wisdom from a third party, it seems less arrogant and more acceptable. Of course, when you have someone like my dad in your back pocket, you can't help yourself. You quote him every chance you get. My dad gave me advice on how to negotiate my way through life. He'd say things like, never make a decision until you have to. He'd also warn me that even if I was in a position of strength, whether at work or in relationships, I had to play fair. Just because you're in the driver's seat, he'd say, doesn't mean you have to run people over. Lately, I find myself quoting my dad even if it was something he didn't say. Whatever my point, it might as well have come from him. He seemed to know everything. My mother, meanwhile, knew plenty, too. All my life, she saw it as part of her mission to keep my cockiness in check. I'm grateful for that now. Even these days, if someone asks her what I was like as a kid, she describes me as alert, but not terribly precocious. We now live in an age when parents praise every child as a genius. And here's my mother, figuring, alert, ought to suffice as a compliment. When I was studying for my PhD, I took something called the theory qualifier, which I can now definitively say was the second worst thing in my life after chemotherapy. When I complained to my mother about how hard and awful the test was, she leaned over, patted me on the arm and said, "We know just how you feel, honey. And remember, when your father was your age, he was fighting the Germans." After I got my PhD, my mother took great relish in introducing me by saying, "This is my son. He's a doctor, but not the kind who helps people." My parents knew what it really took to help people. They were always finding big projects off the beaten path, then throwing themselves into them. Together, They underwrote a 50-student dormitory in rural Thailand, which was designed to help girls remain in school and avoid prostitution. My mother was always supremely charitable. And my father would have been happy giving everything away and living in a sackcloth instead of in the suburbs, where the rest of us wanted to live. In that sense, I consider my father the most Christian man I've ever met. He was also a huge champion of social equality. Unlike my mom, he didn't easily embrace organized religion. We were Presbyterians. He was more focused on the grandest ideals and saw equality as the greatest of goals. He had high hopes for society, and though his hopes were too often dashed, he remained a raging optimist. At age 83, my dad was diagnosed with leukemia. Knowing he didn't have long to live, he arranged to donate his body to medical science, and he gave money to continue his program in Thailand for at least 6 more years. Many people who saw my last lecture were taken with one particular photo that I flashed on the overhead screen. It's a photo in which I'm in my pajamas, leaning on my elbow, and it's so obvious that I was a kid who loved to dream big dreams. The wood slat that cuts across my body is the front of the bunk bed. My dad, a pretty able woodworker, made me that bed. The smile on that kid's face, the wood slat, the look in his eyes, that photo reminds me that I won the parent lottery. Although my children will have a loving mother who I know will guide them through life brilliantly, they will not have their father. I've accepted that, but it does hurt. I'd like to believe my dad would have approved of how I'm going about these last months of my life. He would have advised me to put everything in order for Jay, to spend as much time as possible with the kids, the things I'm doing. I know he would see the sense in moving the family to Virginia. I also think my dad would be reminding me that kids, more than anything else, need to know their parents love them. Their parents don't have to be alive for that to happen. 5. The elevator in the ranch house. My imagination was always pretty hard to contain, and halfway through high school, I felt this urge to splash some of the thoughts swirling in my head onto the walls of my childhood bedroom. I asked my parents for permission. I want to paint things on my walls, I said. Like what? They asked. Things that matter to me, I said. Things I think will be cool. You'll see. That explanation was enough for my father. That's what was so great about him. He encouraged creativity just by smiling at you. He loved to watch the spark of enthusiasm turn into fireworks. And he understood me and my need to express myself in unconventional ways. So he thought my wall painting adventure was a great idea. My mother wasn't so high on the whole escapade, but she relented pretty quickly when she saw how excited I was. She also knew Dad usually won out on these things. She might as well surrender peacefully. For 2 days, with the help of my sister, Tammy, and my friend Jack Sheriff, I painted on the walls of my bedroom. My father sat in the living room, reading the newspaper, patiently waiting for the unveiling. My mother hovered in the hallway, completely nervous. She kept sneaking up on us, trying to get a peek, but we remained barricaded in the room. Like they say in the movies, this was a closed set. What did we paint? Well, I wanted to have a quadratic formula on the wall. In a quadratic equation, the highest power of an unknown quantity is a square. Always the nerd, I thought that was worth celebrating. Right by the door, Jack and I painted a large silver elevator door. To the left of the door, we drew up and down buttons, and above the elevator, we painted a panel with floor numbers 1 through 6. The number 3 was illuminated. We lived in a ranch house. It was just 1 level, so I was doing a bit of fantasizing to imagine 6 floors. But looking back, why didn't I paint 80 or 90 floors? If I was such a big shot dreamer, why did my elevator stop at 3? I don't know. Maybe it was a symbol of the balance in my life between aspiration and pragmatism. Given my limited artistic skills, I thought it best if I sketched things out in basic geometric shapes. So I painted a simple rocket ship with fins. I painted Snow White's mirror with the line, "Remember when I told you that you were the fairest?" I lied. On the ceiling, Jack and I wrote the words, "I'm trapped in the attic." We did the letters backwards, so it seemed as if we'd imprisoned someone up there and he was scratching out an SOS. Because I loved chess, Tammy painted chess pieces. She was the only one of us with any drawing talent. While she handled that, I painted a submarine lurking in a body of water behind the bunk bed. I drew a periscope rising above the bedspread, in search of enemy ships. I always liked the story of Pandora's box, so Tammy and I painted our version of it. Pandora, from Greek mythology, was given a box with all the world's evils in it. She disobeyed orders not to open it. When the lid came off, evil spread throughout the world. I was always drawn to the story's optimistic ending. Left at the bottom of the box was hope. So inside my Pandora's box, I wrote the word hope. Jack saw that and couldn't resist writing the word Bob over hope. When friends visited my room, it always took them a minute to figure out why the word Bob was there. Then came the inevitable eye roll. Given that it was the late 1970s, I wrote the words disco sucks over my door. My mother thought that was vulgar. One day when I wasn't looking, she quietly painted over the word sucks. That was the only editing she ever did. Friends who'd come by were always pretty impressed. "I can't believe your parents let you do this," they'd say. Though my mother wasn't thrilled at the time, she never painted over the room, even decades after I'd moved out. In fact, over time, my bedroom became the focal point of her house tour when anyone came to visit. My mom began to realize, people thought this was definitely cool. And they thought she was cool for allowing me to do it. Anybody out there who is a parent, if your kids want to paint their bedrooms, as a favor to me, let them do it. It'll be okay. Don't worry about resale value on the house. I don't know how many more times I will get to visit my childhood home. But it is a gift every time I go there. I still sleep in that bunk bed my father built. I look at those crazy walls, I think about my parents allowing me to paint, and I fall asleep feeling lucky and pleased. 6. Getting to 0G. It's important to have specific dreams. When I was in grade school, a lot of kids wanted to become astronauts. I was aware, from an early age, that NASA wouldn't want me. I had heard that astronauts couldn't have glasses. I was okay with that. I didn't really want the whole astronaut gig. I just wanted the floating. Turns out that NASA has a plane it uses to help astronauts acclimate to zero gravity. Everyone calls it the Vomit Comet, even though NASA refers to it as the Weightless Wonder, a public relations gesture aimed at distracting attention from the obvious. Whatever the plane is called, it's a sensational piece of machinery. It does parabolic arcs, and at the top of each arc, you get about 25 seconds when you experience the rough equivalent of weightlessness. As the plane dives, you feel like you're on a runaway roller coaster, but you're suspended, flying around. My dream became a possibility when I learned that NASA had a program in which college students could submit proposals for experiments on the plane. In 2001, our team of Carnegie Mellon students proposed a project using virtual reality. Being weightless is a sensation hard to fathom when you've been an earthling all your life. In zero gravity, the inner ear, which controls balance, isn't quite in sync with what your eyes are telling you. Nausea is often the result. Could virtual reality dry runs on the ground help? That was the question in our proposal, and it was a winner. We were invited to Johnson Space Center in Houston to ride the plane. I was probably more excited than any of my students. Floating. But late in the process, I got bad news. NASA made it very clear that under no circumstances could faculty advisors fly with their students. I was heartbroken, but I was not deterred. I would find a way around this brick wall. I decided to carefully read all the literature about the program, looking for loopholes. And I found one. NASA, always eager for good publicity, would allow a journalist from the student's hometown to come along for the ride. I called an official at NASA to ask for his fax number. "What are you going to fax us?" he asked. I explained. My resignation as the faculty advisor and my application as the journalist. "I'll be accompanying my students in my new role as a member of the media," I said. And he said, "That's a little transparent, don't you think?" I just wanted the floating. "Sure," I said, but I also promised him that I'd get information about our experiment onto news websites, and send film of our virtual reality efforts to more mainstream journalists. I knew I could pull that off, and it was win-win for everyone. He gave me his fax number. As an aside, there's a lesson here: have something to bring to the table, because that will make you more welcome. My experience in 0G was spectacular, and no, I didn't throw up, thank you. I did get banged up a bit, though, because at the end of the magical 25 seconds, when gravity returns to the plane, it's actually as if you've become twice your weight. You can slam down pretty hard. That's why we were repeatedly told, feet down. You don't want to crash land on your neck. But I did manage to get on that plane, almost 4 decades after floating became one of my life goals. It just proves that if you can find an opening, you can probably find a way to float through it. 7. I never made it to the NFL. I love football. Tackle football. I started playing when I was 9 years old, and football got me through. It helped make me who I am today. And even though I did not reach the National Football League, I sometimes think I got more from pursuing that dream, and not accomplishing it, than I did from many of the ones I did accomplish. My romance with football started when my dad dragged me, kicking and screaming, to join a league. I had no desire to be there. I was naturally wimpy, and the smallest kid by far. Fear turned to awe when I met my coach, Jim Graham, a hulking, 6'4" wall of a guy. He had been a linebacker at Penn State, and was seriously old school. I mean, really old school, like he thought the forward pass was a trick play. On the first day of practice, we were all scared to death. Plus he hadn't brought along any footballs. One kid finally spoke up for all of us. "Excuse me, coach. There are no footballs." And Coach Graham responded, "We don't need any footballs." There was a silence, while we thought about that. "How many men are on the football field at a time?" he asked us. 11 on a team, we answered. "So that makes 22. And how many people are touching the football at any given time?" "One of them." "Right," he said. "So we're going to work on what those other 21 guys are doing." Fundamentals. That was a great gift Coach Graham gave us. Fundamentals, fundamentals, fundamentals. As a college professor, I've seen this as one lesson so many kids ignore, always to their detriment. You've got to get the fundamentals down, because otherwise the fancy stuff is not going to work. Coach Graham used to ride me hard. I remember one practice in particular. "You're doing it all wrong, Pausch. Go back. Do it again." I tried to do what he wanted. It wasn't enough. "You owe me, Pausch. You're doing push-ups after practice." When I was finally dismissed, one of the assistant coaches came over to reassure me. "Coach Graham rode you pretty hard, didn't he?" he said. I could barely muster a, "Yeah." "That's a good thing," the assistant told me. "When you're screwing up and nobody says anything to you anymore, that means they've given up on you." That lesson has stuck with me my whole life. When you see yourself doing something badly and nobody's bothering to tell you anymore, that's a bad place to be. You may not want to hear it, but your critics are often the ones telling you they still love you and care about you, and want to make you better. There's a lot of talk these days about giving children self-esteem. It's not something you can give, it's something they have to build. Coach Graham worked in a no-coddling zone. Self-esteem. He knew there was really only one way to teach kids how to develop it. You give them something they can't do, they work hard until they find they can do it, and you just keep repeating the process. When Coach Graham first got hold of me, I was this wimpy kid with no skills, no physical strength, and no conditioning. But he made me realize that if I work hard enough, there will be things I can do tomorrow that I can't do today. Even now, having just turned 47, I can give you a 3-point stance that any NFL lineman would be proud of. I realize that, these days, a guy like Coach Graham might get thrown out of a youth sports league. He'd be too tough. Parents would complain. I remember one game when our team was playing terribly. At halftime, in our rush for water, we almost knocked over the water bucket. Coach Graham was livid. "Geez. That's the most I've seen you boys move since this game started." We were 11 years old, just standing there, afraid he'd pick us up one by one and break us with his bare hands. "Water," he barked. "You boys want water." He lifted the bucket and dumped all the water on the ground. We watched him walk away and heard him mutter to an assistant coach, "You can give water to the first-string defense." They played okay. Now let me be clear, Coach Graham would never endanger any kid. One reason he worked so hard on conditioning was he knew it reduces injuries. However, it was a chilly day, we'd all had access to water during the first half, and the dash to the water bucket was more about us being a bunch of brats than really needing hydration. Even so, if that kind of incident happened today, parents on the sidelines would be pulling out their cell phones to call the league commissioner, or maybe their lawyer. It saddens me that many kids today are so coddled. I think back to how I felt during that halftime rant. Yes, I was thirsty. But more than that, I felt humiliated. We had all let down Coach Graham, and he let us know it in a way we'd never forget. He was right. We had shown more energy at the water bucket than we had in the damn game. And getting chewed out by him meant something to us. During the second half, we went back on the field, and gave it our all. I haven't seen Coach Graham since I was a teen, but he just keeps showing up in my head, forcing me to work harder whenever I feel like quitting, forcing me to be better. He gave me a feedback loop for life. When we send our kids to play organized sports, football, soccer, swimming, whatever, for most of us, it's not because we're desperate for them to learn the intricacies of the sport. What we really want them to learn is far more important: teamwork, perseverance, sportsmanship, the value of hard work, and ability to deal with adversity. This kind of indirect learning is what some of us like to call a head fake. There are two kinds of head fakes. The first is literal. On a football field, a player will move his head one way so you'll think he's going in that direction. Then he goes the opposite way. It's like a magician using misdirection. Coach Graham used to tell us to watch a player's waist. Where his belly button goes, his body goes, he'd say. The second kind of head fake is the really important one, the one that teaches people things they don't realize they're learning until well into the process. If you're a head fake specialist, your hidden objective is to get them to learn something you want them to learn. This kind of head fake learning is absolutely vital. And Coach Graham was the master. 8. You'll find me under V. I live in the computer age and I love it here. I have long embraced pixels, multi-screen workstations and the information superhighway. I really can picture a paperless world. And yet, I grew up in a very different place. When I was born in 1960, paper was where great knowledge was recorded. In my house, all through the 1960s and 1970s, our family worshipped the World Book Encyclopedia, the photos, the maps, the flags of different countries, the handy sidebars revealing each state's population, motto and average elevation. I didn't read every word of every volume of the World Book, but I gave it a shot. I was fascinated by how it all came together. Who wrote that section on the aardvark? How that must have been, to have the World Book editors call and say, "You know aardvarks better than anyone. Would you write an entry for us?" Then there was the Z volume. Who was the person deemed enough of a Zulu expert to create that entry? Was he or she a Zulu? My parents were frugal. Unlike many Americans, they would never buy anything for the purposes of impressing other people, or as any kind of luxury for themselves. But they happily bought the World Book, spending a princely sum at the time, because by doing so, they were giving the gift of knowledge to me and my sister. They also ordered the annual companion volumes. Each year, a new volume of breakthroughs and current events would arrive, labeled 1970, 1971, 1972, 1973, and I couldn't wait to read them. These annual volumes came with stickers, referencing entries in the original, alphabetical World Books. My job was to attach those stickers on the appropriate pages, and I took that responsibility seriously. I was helping to chronicle history and science for anyone who opened those encyclopedias in the future. Given how I cherished the World Book, one of my childhood dreams was to be a contributor. But it's not like you can call World Book headquarters in Chicago and suggest yourself. The World Book has to find you. A few years ago, believe it or not, the call finally came. It turned out that somehow, my career up to that time had turned me into exactly the sort of expert that World Book felt comfortable badgering. They didn't think I was the most important virtual reality expert in the world. That person was too busy for them to approach. But me, I was in that mid-range level, just respectable enough, but not so famous that I'd turn them down. "Would you like to write our new entry on virtual reality?" they asked. I couldn't tell them that I'd been waiting all my life for this call. All I could say was, "Yes, of course." I wrote the entry. And I included a photo of my student Caitlin Kelleher wearing a virtual reality headset. No editor ever questioned what I wrote, but I assume that's the World Book way. They pick an expert and trust that the expert won't abuse the privilege. I have not bought the latest set of World Books. In fact, having been selected to be an author in the World Book, I now believe that Wikipedia is a perfectly fine source for your information, because I know what the quality control is for real encyclopedias. But sometimes when I'm in a library with the kids, I still can't resist looking under V, virtual reality, by yours truly, and letting them have a look. Their dad made it. 9. A skill set called leadership. Like countless American nerds. Born in 1960, I spent part of my childhood dreaming of being Captain James T. Kirk, commander of the Starship Enterprise. I didn't see myself as Captain Pausch. I imagined a world where I actually got to be Captain Kirk. For ambitious young boys with a scientific bent, there could be no greater role model than James T. Kirk of Star Trek. In fact, I seriously believe that I became a better teacher and colleague, maybe even a better husband, by watching Kirk run the Enterprise. Think about it. If you've seen the TV show, you know that Kirk was not the smartest guy on the ship. Mr. Spock, his first officer, was the always logical intellect on board. Dr. McCoy had all the medical knowledge available to mankind in the 2260s. Scotty was the chief engineer, who had the technical know-how to keep that ship running, even when it was under attack by aliens. So what was Kirk's skill set? Why did he get to climb on board the Enterprise and run it? The answer: there is this skill set called leadership. I learned so much by watching this guy in action. He was the distilled essence of the dynamic manager, a guy who knew how to delegate, had the passion to inspire, and looked good in what he wore to work. He never professed to have skills greater than his subordinates. He acknowledged that they knew what they were doing in their domains. But he established the vision, the tone. He was in charge of morale. On top of that, Kirk had the romantic chops to woo women in every galaxy he visited. Picture me at home watching TV, a 10-year-old in glasses. Every time Kirk showed up on the screen he was like a Greek god to me. And he had the coolest damn toys. When I was a kid, I thought it was fascinating that he could be on some planet and he had this thing, this Star Trek communicator device, that let him talk to people back on the ship. I now walk around with one in my pocket. Who remembers that it was Kirk who introduced us to the cell phone? A few years ago, I got a call on my communicator device from a Pittsburgh author named Chip Walter. He was co-writing a book with William Shatner, aka Kirk, about how scientific breakthroughs first imagined on Star Trek foreshadowed today's technological advancements. Captain Kirk wanted to visit my virtual reality lab at Carnegie Mellon. Granted, my childhood dream was to be Kirk. But I still considered it a dream realized when Shatner showed up. It's cool to meet your boyhood idol, but it's almost indescribably cooler when he comes to you to see cool stuff you're doing in your lab. My students and I worked around the clock to build a virtual reality world that resembled the bridge of the Enterprise. When Shatner arrived, we put this bulky, head-mounted display on him. It had a screen inside, and as he turned his head, he could immerse himself in 360-degree images of his old ship. "Wow, you even have the turbolift doors," he said. And we had a surprise for him, too: red alert sirens. Without missing a beat, he barked, "We're under attack." Shatner stayed for 3 hours and asked tons of questions. A colleague later said to me, "He just kept asking and asking. He doesn't seem to get it." But I was hugely impressed. Shatner, was the ultimate example of a man who knew what he didn't know, was perfectly willing to admit it, and didn't want to leave until he understood. That's heroic to me. I wish every grad student had that attitude. During my cancer treatment, when I was told that only 4% of pancreatic cancer patients live 5 years, a line from the Star Trek movie The Wrath of Khan came into my head. In the film, Starfleet cadets are faced with a simulated training scenario where, no matter what they do, their entire crew is killed. The film explains that when Kirk was a cadet, he reprogrammed the simulation because he didn't believe in the no-win scenario. Over the years, some of my sophisticated academic colleagues have turned up their noses at my Star Trek infatuation. But from the start, it has never failed to stand me in good stead. After Shatner learned of my diagnosis, he sent me a photo of himself as Kirk. On it he wrote, "I don't believe in the no-win scenario." 10. Winning big. Oh nay of my earliest childhood Dre. Ams was to be the coolest guy at any amusement park or carnival I visited. I always knew exactly how that kind of coolness was achieved. The coolest guy was easy to spot, he was the one walking around with the largest stuffed animal. As a kid, I'd see some guy off in the distance with his head and body mostly hidden by an enormous stuffed animal. It didn't matter if he was a buffed up Adonis, or if he was some nerd who couldn't get his arms around it. If he had the biggest stuffed animal, then he was the coolest guy at the carnival. My dad subscribed to the same belief. He felt naked on a Ferris wheel if he didn't have a huge, newly won bear or ape on his hip. Given the competitiveness in our family, midway games became a battle. Which one of us could capture the largest beast in the stuffed animal kingdom? Have you ever walked around a carnival with a giant stuffed animal? Have you ever watched how people look at you and envy you? Have you ever used a stuffed animal to woo a woman? I have, and I married her. Giant stuffed animals have played a role in my life from the start. There was that time when I was 3 years old and my sister was 5. We were in a store's toy department, and my father said he'd buy us any one item if we could agree on it and share it. We looked around, and eventually we looked up and saw, on the highest shelf, a giant stuffed rabbit. "We'll take that," my sister said. It was probably the most expensive item in the toy department. But my father was a man of his word. And so he bought it for us. He likely figured it was a good investment. A home could always use another giant stuffed animal. As I reached adulthood and kept showing up with more and bigger stuffed animals, my father suspected that I was paying people off. He assumed that I was waiting for winners over by the squirt guns, and then slipping a 50 to some guy who didn't realize how a giant stuffed animal could change the world's perception of him. But I never paid for a stuffed animal. And I never cheated. Okay, I admit that I leaned. That's the only way to do it at the ring toss. I am a leaner, but I am not a cheater. I did, however, do a lot of my winning out of view of my family. And I know that increased suspicions. But I found the best way to bag stuffed animals is without the pressure of a family audience. I also didn't want anyone to know just how long it took me to be successful. Tenacity is a virtue, but it's not always crucial for everyone to observe how hard you work at something. Have you ever walked around a carnival with a giant stuffed animal? I am prepared now to reveal that there are 2 secrets to winning giant stuffed animals: long arms and a small amount of discretionary income. I have been blessed in life to have both. I talked about my stuffed animals at my last lecture, and showed photos of them. I could predict what the tech-savvy cynics were thinking. In this age of digitally manipulated images, maybe those stuffed bears weren't really in the pictures with me. Or maybe I sweet-talked the actual winners into letting me have my photo taken next to their prizes. How, in this age of cynicism, could I convince my audience that I'd really won these things? Well, I would show them the actual stuffed animals. And so I had some of my students walk in from the wings of the stage, each carrying a giant stuffed animal I'd won over the years. I don't need these trophies anymore. And although I know my wife loved the stuffed bear I'd hung in her office when we were courting, 3 children later, she doesn't want an army of them cluttering up our new house. They were leaking styrofoam beads that were making their way into Chloe's mouth. I knew that if I kept the stuffed animals, someday Jay would be calling Goodwill and saying, "Take them away." Or worse, feeling she couldn't. That's why I had decided, why don't I give them to friends? And so once they were lined up on stage, I announced, "Anybody who would like a piece of me at the end of this, feel free to come up and take a bear, first come, first served." The giant stuffed animals all found homes quickly. A few days later, I learned that one of the animals had been taken by a Carnegie Mellon student who, like me, has cancer. After the lecture, she walked up and selected the giant elephant. I love the symbolism of that. She got the elephant in the room. 11. The happiest place on earth. In 1969, when I was 8 years old, my family went on a cross-country trip to see Disneyland. It was an absolute quest. And once we got there, I was just in awe of the place. It was the coolest environment I'd ever been in. As I stood in line with all the other kids, all I could think was, I can't wait to make stuff like this. 2 decades later, when I got my PhD in computer science from Carnegie Mellon, I thought that made me infinitely qualified to do anything, so I dashed off my letters of application to Walt Disney Imagineering. And they sent me some of the nicest go-to-hell letters I'd ever received. They said they had reviewed my application, and they did not have any positions which require your particular qualifications. Nothing. This is a company famous for hiring armies of people to sweep the streets. Disney had nothing for me. Not even a broom. So that was a setback. But I kept my mantra in mind: the brick walls are there for a reason. They're not there to keep us out. The brick walls are there to give us a chance to show how badly we want something. Fast forward to 1995. I'd become a professor at the University of Virginia, and I'd helped build a system called virtual reality on $5 a day. This was at a time when virtual reality experts were insisting they'd need $500,000 to do anything. And my colleagues and I did our own little version of the Hewlett-Packard garage thing and hacked together a working low-budget virtual reality system. People in the computer science world thought this was pretty great. Not too long after, I learned that Disney Imagineering was working on a virtual reality project. It was top secret, and it was an Aladdin attraction that would allow people to ride a magic carpet. I called Disney and explained that I was a virtual reality researcher looking for information on it. I was ridiculously persistent, and I kept getting passed on and on until I was connected to a guy named John Snoddy. He happened to be the brilliant Imagineer running the team. I felt as if I had called the White House and been put through to the president. After we chatted a while, I told John I'd be coming to California. Could we get together? Truth was, if he said yes, the only reason I'd be coming would be to see him. I'd have gone to Neptune to see him. He told me okay. If I was coming anyway, we could have lunch. Before going to see him, I did 80 hours of homework. I asked all the virtual reality hotshots I knew to share their thoughts and questions about this Disney project. As a result, when I finally met John, he was wowed by how prepared I was. It's easy to look smart when you're parroting smart people. Then, at the end of the lunch, I made the ask. I have a sabbatical coming up, I said. What's that? He asked, which was my first hint of the academic entertainment culture clash I'd be facing. After I explained the concept of sabbaticals, he thought it would be a fine idea to have me spend mine with his team. The deal was, I'd come for 6 months, work on a project, and publish a paper about it. I was thrilled. It was almost unheard of for Imagineering to invite an academic like me inside their secretive operation. The only problem, I needed permission from my bosses to take this kind of oddball sabbatical. Well, every Disney story needs a villain, and mine happened to be a certain Dean from the University of Virginia. Dean Wormer, as Jay dubbed him in homage to the film Animal House, was concerned that Disney would suck all this intellectual property out of my head that rightfully belonged to the university. He argued against my doing it. I asked him, "Do you think this is a good idea at all?" And he said, "I have no idea if it is a good idea." He was proof that, sometimes, the most impenetrable brick walls are made of flesh. Because I was getting nowhere with him, I took my case to the Dean of Sponsored Research. I asked him, "Do you think it's a good idea that I do this?" And he answered, "I don't have enough information to say. But I do know that one of my star faculty members is in my office and he's really excited. So tell me more." My sister and me on the Alice ride, all I could think was, I can't wait to make stuff like this. Now, here's a lesson for managers and administrators. Both deans said the same thing. They didn't know if this sabbatical was a good idea. But think about how differently they said it. I ended up being allowed to take that sabbatical, and it was a fantasy come true. In fact, I have a confession. This is exactly how geeky I am. Soon after I arrived in California, I hopped into my convertible and drove over to Imagineering headquarters. It was a hot summer night, and I had the soundtrack to Disney's The Lion King blasting on my stereo. Tears actually began streaming down my face as I drove past the building. Here I was, the grown-up version of that wide-eyed 8-year-old at Disneyland. I had finally arrived. I was an Imagineer. 3. Adventures and lessons learned.